Welcome back. You're here today because you are wondering if some of your relationship issues could be due to a terrible history in your husband's past. And I know firsthand what it looks like to be in a relationship where you're just constantly hitting this brick wall, where you don't know, you feel like something else is happening that you just aren't quite aware of. So, whether or not you know that your husband suffered trauma in his past, or if it's something that you suspect, I want you to know that there are some signs that can help you determine if some of these patterns could be due to that. And the good news is that even if your husband hasn't fully disclosed this information, there are things that you can do starting today to start creating new patterns. But before I start to get to some of those signs, I do want to give some very sobering statistics about disclosure. Men often disclose at a much older age than women do, and the average age that men disclose, especially sexual childhood abuse, is 52 years of age. And men are the least likely to report being assaulted, even though they make up 10% of all victims. And most sexual abuse of males begins before puberty, before about 10 years of age. And between 70 and 90% of males do not report telling anyone at the time. And males disclose being sexually abused an average of 22 years after the assault. And this is 10 years later than females. And even though they may disclose 22 years after the assault, they report that they didn't have a good discussion or an in-depth discussion about the abuse until 28 years later, and the first helpful discussion in 30 years. So you as a spouse could be in a situation where something has happened in your husband's past, but he is not ready to let you in on it yet. And as a spouse who is not aware of this history, you may be very confused and you may start to doubt your own sanity. But I want you to know that even if you aren't totally aware of what has happened in your husband's past, there are some things that I want you to start looking at. Now, we are going to go into details about the trauma survivor's brain in the next session, but I want to talk right now about, okay, we're going to go into the past and we're going to look at some of the things that might have happened when you were dating and some of the things that you're seeing right now that could give you an indication that, yeah, this might be something that is happening in your relationship. So, what are some of these signs? I want you to think back to when you were dating and now, currently, when you have discussions with your husband about his past. Does your husband skip over conversations about their childhood, or do they say some things like, oh, yeah, no, everything was fine, or things were just very normal, but not go into any depth about them? This could be a sign that there was something that happened in the past that they're just not quite ready to tell you. And the other thing that you may see, if this is the case, is control. Control is an avenue that trauma survivors use to cope with their abuse. And this control is more about keeping them safe. So when survivors were abused as children, they had no control over what happened to them. And as adults, they use control to protect themselves. And you may see this in your relationship where they want to control the flow of the relationship, or they may carefully manipulate the dynamics of how close they let you get and what you think of them. And they may even start to limit, or you may have noticed it even when you were dating, that they limited how often you saw each other, and they wanted to be in control of those dynamics. However, some survivors don't use any of those outlets, and instead, they just push people away. So when you try and get deeper in the relationship and they pull back, when you just start to get a little bit in there, and they may just evaporate, never allowing you near enough to truly see their vulnerable side. I've already talked about some of the extreme emotional reactions that you may see as well. And it seems like things that are routine for other parents and other couples to work through can lead to very heated arguments in your relationship. And it often stems from them feeling like they haven't been heard or that they feel that they're being blamed for something. And it's all stemming from the abuse, where they have this terrible guilt for the abuse that occurred to them. And that's been their defense mechanism, is to get defensive and to have these emotional reactions come up so they don't have to address it. You may also notice withdrawal, and this is like a dissociative symptom involving some sort of psychological retreat where the survivor disconnects from their surroundings and also themselves. And this is different than just needing a break after a fight. It's what I call a flip being switched, where all of a sudden they're out and there is nothing that you can do or say to bring them out of it until they're ready. And we all know that depression, anxiety, and the use of mind-altering substances is higher for those who have experienced trauma in their childhood. So those are some of the things that you may have noticed when you were dating, and also while you were married, that may be signs that a traumatic past may be at play here. And it's so important to know that these are just some of the signs, and these can be attributed to other factors as well. And only a professional will be able to diagnose it with certainty. But you knowing and seeing some of these patterns in your spouse can help you try and figure out and deal with these in a healthier way. So what can you do if you suspect that a traumatic past is the cause of some of the behaviors you're seeing? The first thing you can do is just try and have a conversation and approach it with empathy and understanding. There's often an overwhelming feeling of shame by a man who has experienced childhood trauma. And in most cases, they would rather take this secret to the grave rather than tell anyone about it. So having these conversations may need to occur over and over again. You just letting them know that you love them, that no matter what happened to them in the past, you can handle it, and that you will always be ready if they are ready to talk. So while there's no silver bullet to having that conversation end up in disclosure, it requires a lot of patience. And unfortunately, there is just nothing that you're going to be able to do to make the process go any faster. And our job is just to create that safe environment for your husband to be able to tell. But the reason that I created this survival guide is because I don't want you to lose yourself in this process. If you suspect that your husband has experienced childhood trauma, or you know that there's a traumatic past, there are some things that you can do to create new patterns starting today. And this is just not something that you can schedule some date nights and find your love language. You will probably have crises of faith, a lot of anger towards your spouse, anger towards those who did these terrible things to them. But we have to bring these to the surface and confront them head on. Even without disclosure, there are things that you can do to gain more control in the chaos. So there is an enormous demand for us to start discussing and dealing with this and stop being silent. So once you know some of these signs, I want you to listen to the next session, and it's going to be all about talking about how the trauma brain evolved because of the abuse and how this is playing out in your marriage.